peripheral nerve, right? See, this is the axon, which is a continuation of the cell body of a neuron, and this is in turn covered by Schwann cell, which is what we call myelination. So if there is any problem, this Schwann cell disintegrates, and then comes the problem of demyelination, right? So this is one fibril, and this is covered by endoneurium. So one axon covered by Schwann cell is covered by endoneurium. There are a group of axons which are put together, which we call it as fascicle, and that is covered by perineurium, right? And there can be multiple fascicles in a nerve, in a peripheral nerve, and these are put together in a fascial sheath, and that is called epineurium, right? This is very important because based on this architecture and anatomy, the severity of nerve injury will vary. So nerve injury, the reasons for nerve injury can be anything. It can be starting from ischemia, where there is reduction of blood supply to a peripheral nerve. There can be compression. Here the compression is because of application of tourniquet. This can also happen with a BP cuff as well. This particular patient was applied tourniquet in the proximal part of his limb for a forearm surgery here. And because of compression, you can see the blanching here and the skin color here. See, this skin color here is pink, whereas it is blanched here. So this part of the limb is ischemic now. But rather than the ischemia, there is actual compression happening here, and this compression can also lead on to nerve injury. And another way of compression where the individual's arm is being compressed here from the posterior aspect. Can anyone tell me what is this? There is a common name for this phenomenon.
Saturday night palsy.
Yeah, very good. This is Saturday night palsy. So after getting drunk, the individual sleeps on a couch or a chair, especially with a dangerous position where the nerve gets compressed against a solid surface. So this is one form of compression. And this is another form of compression where, because of inappropriate use of the crutches, the nerves or the any neural structure in the axilla is getting compressed. Usually when a patient uses the crutches properly, there is no compression here because there is a space of minimum 2 to 3 fingers gap between the top end of the crutch and the undersurface of the axilla. But if this height is inappropriate or the patient is not educated regarding the proper use of a crutch, then there can be pressure in the axilla, and this again can cause compression, peripheral neuropathy. And this is traction. Here actually the patient is falling from height, and in order to prevent the fall, he is suddenly grasping another object. And this causes sudden hyperabduction of his arm. Therefore, the nerves in the axilla located here can be subjected to traction decrease. In the previous pictures, what you saw was compression. Here it is traction, and this can also lead to nerve injury. Laceration, an open injury where the nerve is cut through and through. Burns. Burns can also damage the peripheral nerves because the depth of burn, depending on the severity of the burn, we call it, we grade, right? So once the severity of burn increases, the thermal damage can penetrate the soft tissue and can damage the nerves, leading on to nerve injury. So how do they commonly classify nerve injuries? The simplest form of nerve injury is this one, transient nerve ischemia. I'm sure every one of us must have experienced this. Whenever you sit in a cross-leg position for like this for a longer duration, you usually feel that the limb, the distal part of the leg goes numb, which is commonly called as sleeping limb, because it is a very transient condition, and once we extend our knees, the situation, the problem goes away. This arises because of endoneural anoxia. Again, this is a compression, or this is both an ischemic as well as a compression problem. Because of this position, the nerve doesn't get sufficient amount of blood supply, leading on to anoxia. And this causes endoneural anoxia, leading on to transient nerve ischemia. And if for the first 15 minutes, usually the patient is comfortable, but beyond 15 minutes, we start feeling numbness and some tingling sensation in the foot. If this is continued for 30 minutes, usually there is loss of pain sensibility. And beyond 45 minutes, the muscle becomes weak, because we may see that for religious purposes, And in mass gatherings where people usually tend to sit like this for longer duration, the moment they try to stand, they feel that their limb is weak. That is because of the muscle weakness, which is due to the nerve supply, the damage in the nerve supply to the muscle. But once the compression is relieved, usually the problem is dissipated, and sensation as well as the motor power is restored. Sensation is the first to return back, usually within 30 seconds. The pins and needle sensation may be there for 10 minutes, but full muscle power is regained in another 10 minutes time. So this is the simplest form of nerve injury. Simplest, or in other words, the minimal form of nerve injury. And with regards to classification system, we usually have two very popular classification. One is the Sedan's and others is Sunderland. With regards to Sedan's classification, if you consider this as a normal nerve, very simplified picture to show the nerve body and the axon covered by the myelin sheath, covered by the endoneurium, which in turn covered by perineurium, which in turn is covered by the epineurium, right? And if there is only compression alone, there is a conduction block, right? Or there is axonotomy. The axon alone is damaged, but all these neural tubes are still intact, right? This is called axonotomesis. This is nothing but a I should have started here. A conduction neuropraxia. This is nothing but actually the axon is still intact, but there is also conduction block. This is because of compression. Here the axon is also intact, and all the neural sheath are also intact. And this is a very the next severe grade of transient endoneural ischemia, and this recovers. There's very good recovery potential. Whereas the next severe type of injury is the axonotomesis, where the axon is damaged, but still the neural tubes are intact. But then comes neurotomesis, where including the axon and all the neural coverings are damaged. Is this slide clear? This is the normal. This is neuropraxia, where there is no anatomical defect actually, but there is conduction block. Here the axon is damaged, but the neural tubes are still intact. And here, with regards to neurotomesis, all structures of the peripheral nerve are damaged. And this is a very severe nerve injury. Next comes the Sunderland classification, which is just an added features to the Sedan's classification, where again type 1 is the neuropraxia, which is nothing but conduction block. Here the recovery potential is full. And next is the grade 2 is the axonotomesis, where the axon is severe, but the endoneurial tube is still intact. Two shown here, yeah. And here also recovery potential is usually good. But anything more than grade 2, that is grade 3, there comes neurotomesis, where there is preservation of perineurium, but endoneurium is disrupted. Though there may be recovery, it is usually slow and incomplete. Then comes the next degree, where again it is neurotomesis with regards to Sedan's classification, but here only the epineurium is intact. Grade 4, here only the epineurium is intact. Whereas in grade 5, even the epineurium is damaged. And here you can see that there is something called a grade 6, but not mentioned here. Grade 6 is nothing but, this is a combination of severity of injury in one peripheral nerve, because we cannot expect an individual nerve to undergo only a specific damage throughout the nerve. One part of the nerve may be in grade 2, one part of the nerve may be in grade 3. So this picture describes such a scenario where there is one nerve which is damaged, but different parts of the nerve have different grades of injury. This is usually called as grade 6. Usually this is not given in many common books, but this is a clinical scenario. Now, any doubts in these two slides? Because understanding these two is very important with regards to planning for management of nerve injuries. Do we want to repeat these slides for anybody? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Fine. Okay, then I'll proceed. So with regards to clinical features, this is common for any nerve. Usually the clinical features, we divide them into symptoms and signs, right? So what are the symptoms the patient can complain of? They can complain of numbness, they can complain of loss of sensation, there can be weakness of limb, there can be abnormality in gait. And there are signs which usually the physician elicits in a patient, and there can be altered skin features, muscle wasting, abnormal posture of the limb, loss of sensation or loss of muscle power. Now, what are the tests we usually do? With regards to sensation, we check for touch sensation, pain, temperature, position sense, vibration sense, and pressure. 2-point discrimination, and there is also a threshold test and locognosia. These are all the tests which we do for intactness of sensation in that particular limb. Now, how to check for muscle power? This is nothing but the MRC grading, Medical Research Council grading, where grade 0 is there is no visible or palpable contraction. Grade 1 is there is some amount of contraction which can either be seen or it can be felt, but physically there is no movement of the limb. Grade 2, there is movement possible in a joint, but only when the gravity is eliminated. Grade 3, there is movement is possible in the joint, but there is which can also be done against gravity. But when given resistance, the movement is not possible. Grade 4 is movement is possible against some resistance, but full power is not there. Grade 5 is full muscle power. Any doubts in this slide? Because understanding this is also necessary in order to evaluate the severity of injury in that particular nerve. So you should know how to check for sensation and how to check for muscle power. And radial nerve palsy is one of the very commonly kept clinical case scenario or clinical case in your final year examination. So you should be very clear about how to check for, how to elicit a proper muscle power in a patient. Now we will actually come back to this slide once we go to clinical scenarios, which we will see shortly. And what is Tinel sign? Tinel sign is nothing but, this is a physical sign where usually if suppose the nerve is injured here or injured here, the recovery is starting from proximal to distal along the track of the nerve. Here the pictorial, this is a pictorial presentation of the ulnar nerve, right? And once you start tapping from distal to proximal, please remember that Tinel sign should be elicited only by tapping from distal to proximal, not from proximal to distal. And this is not a one-time clinical examination. This clinical examination is meant for follow-up. For example, you see the patient on day 1 and you think this is either grade 1 or grade 2 injury and this has complete recovery potential. You document this in your case sheet or the patient's book, whatever is the thing used for recording findings. And during the next visit, you do Tinel sign again. If suppose for this particular case, the first Tinel sign is elicited here. During the next visit, the Tinel sign should, during the first visit, if it's elicited here, during the next visit, this Tinel sign should have progressed distally. So during your first clinical examination, you would have elicited this Tinel sign at the level of the lateral epicondyle or medial epicondyle or just below the medial epicondyle. And during the next visit, maybe 1 month following it, can anybody tell me how much is the recovery of a nerve for 1 day?
1 mm, sir.
Exactly. So in 1 month, how much of nerve recovery you expect?
30.
30. So on day 1, if it is here, after 30 days, it should have progressed here, 3 centimeters below this previous point. So this shows that the nerve recovery is happening and you can have a good recovery potential if Tinel sign is progressive. There are certain scenarios where Tinel sign doesn't progress at all. Even during subsequent visit, it is present only here. Then that shows that nerve recovery is not happening and something else has to be done for this patient, right? So this is how you elicit Tinel sign. But what is Tinel sign actually? Tinel sign is nothing but it is a peripheral dysesthesia provoked by percussion of the nerve. See, if suppose the damage is here, you elicit the part of the nerve which is still intact. And during regeneration, the axon sprouts grow from proximal to distal aspect. And to begin with, these axons are unmyelinated, right? Only after the axons grow to a certain extent, then comes the myelin covering, then comes the endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. So initially, to begin with, the axons are naked. You can call them naked because they don't have a myelin sheath. And these naked axons are hypersensitive, right? So one axon, which was originally supplying this part of the limb, you stimulate that axon, the brain feels as if this particular part is being, the patient has some tingling in this particular part. Because usually there is no stimulation here. You are stimulating here. Are you able to understand the concept? The axon, which was originally supplying the little finger, got damaged at this place and it is regenerating now. and you tap that particular axon, and the patient says he has some tingling or a shock-like sensation because there is that axon supplied here. And this is a cortical sensation. Actually, this is not a peripheral part. This is a cortical sensation. Brain feels as if that particular region is being stimulated, but usually it is a shock-like phenomenon. So it is because of stimulation of naked axons. And one particular important thing to remember is this is absent in neuropraxia. That is because neuropraxia, the axon is still intact and you don't have naked axons to stimulate tinel sign. Therefore, this is not present in grade 1 injury. This is present only from grade 2 injury. And static tinel sign is bad and advancing tinel sign is good. Right. Is everything clear in this slide? Because this is very important. Yeah.
One doubt, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, nerve regeneration happens from proximal to distal, sir.
Exactly.
So advancing tinel sign, it will be distal only, no, sir?
Yeah. See, if during first visit, you elicit the tinel sign here. Right? You check the
Okay,
patient again after 1 month. Right?
Okay,
The tinel sign should have progressed here.
Uh,
See, the nerve is recovering from proximal to distal. The naked axons will be here. The naked axons will not be
okay,
here.
Okay,
Because
sir.
the axons which was originally here would have got myelination and the naked axons would have grown till here now after 1
Okay,
month.
sir. Okay,
So
sir.
this is what we call as advancing tinel sign, which advances from proximal to distal.
Okay,
Suppose if there is no advancement of the tinel sign and the tinel sign is present only here, that shows that there is regrowing axons, but the axons are not able to grow along the tract of the nerve. So this is, we call it as static tinel sign, and this is bad.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Right? Clear now? Clear now?
Yes.
Any doubts? Yeah.
Sir,
For
why it's
anybody else?
absent in neuropraxia?
Yeah, again, there is a very good question because in neuropraxia, the axon is intact. It is only a conduction block. Right? Remember the classification. If you remember this slide, neuropraxia, the axon is still intact. Because of the minimal compression, there is only a conduction block. See, as I said, tinel sign, to elicit tinel sign, you need unmyelinated axons. Here, there is only a conduction block, and this conduction block will recover very easily. And the myelination here is not actually, what to say, the naked, you don't have a naked axon to stimulate, right? Whereas in case of, if you suppose, sorry, if we go here, yeah, the same picture here, the axon is disrupted. Or you can take this picture, for example, the complete neurotmesis. Here, the axon will start to grow from here, and initially they will be naked, and slowly they will get myelinated and all other coverings. So the tinel sign will be positive here. Are you able to understand this now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So when the axon is intact, tinel sign is not there. So in case of grade 1 injuries, you don't have a tinel sign. So only from grade 2, you start experiencing this, you start eliciting the tinel sign. And right. Yeah, this is because of stimulation of naked axons, you get tinel sign. If the axon is covered by the myelin sheath or by the endoneurium, perineurium, usually we don't get this finding. Hope this explains your doubt. Have I cleared your doubt?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, fine. Any doubt for anybody else?
Sir?
Yeah.
Normally, when we try to stimulate that area, sometimes we get a shock-like sensation, sir. Sir.
You mean to say in a normal person, you just stimulate here and you get a shock-like sensation? That is not tinel sign. That is because you are directly crushing or you are directly stimulating the nerve. Because you will know when you elicit a tinel sign, I think you will understand this better. We don't have a patient scenario here, so I can't convey the exact message to you. That is, you commonly tap here and you get a shock-like sensation fully. This is not tinel sign actually. You just stimulate the nerve, or you just you just cause a transient compression of the nerve, which can give rise to something like tinel sign, but clinically that is not tinel sign, right? And here, this tinel sign, if you elicit here, you won't get it because there is nothing on the opposite side to compress it. Whereas with regards to tinel sign, you no need a bone to support it on the opposite. Whereas even if you tap the soft tissue, you will get it. Are you? Am I clearing your doubt? See,
Yes, sir.
in a normal person, you press the bone against a bony landmark. If you press the ulnar nerve against the bone, you may get a shock-like sensation. That is because you are directly pressing the nerve. But you can't elicit tinal sign in a normal person, which is distal to the medial epicondyle, right? Because the axon is covered. It is covered by endoneurium, perineurium, everything. But the same patient, sorry, not the same patient, if the patient has got a nerve injury and the nerve is recovering from proximal to distal, even if you tap the soft tissue there, that will stimulate the naked axons. And you will get a tinal sign there. Are you able to understand the difference now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Fine. Okay. Any other doubts? Okay, I assume there are no doubts. Then we'll move on. To the up to tinal sign, we are discussing the clinical features, and then comes investigations. The most commonly done investigations are electromyography and nerve conduction study. These are the studies which are done to know exactly where the lesion is. That is more helpful with regards to nerve conduction study. An EMG will try to help you whether the muscle is still denervated, or is it partially recovered, or completely recovered, or the muscle is already lost the complete regenerating potential, right? I don't have time to go into the depth of this because discussion about EMG and NCS is itself a separate class. You just know that these are the two electrodiagnostic studies done in case of peripheral nerve injuries. Now coming to management, most common management is conservative. The indications are neuropraxia, low energy injuries, or if there is pure motor, pure sensory nerve injuries, because pure nerves, either motor or sensory, have good recovery potential. So these are the conditions where we go for conservative management. And the aim is just to maintain the joints supple to prevent contractures and to prevent the absent sensation in the skin. Because if the patient doesn't have sensation in the skin, there is possibility of getting injured. The patient may hold on to a hot object and they won't feel the heat there, and this can cause burns. This is more commonly seen in case of leprosy patients who don't have sensation in their hands, and they hold any hot object, they don't feel the heat at all. Only when they see burns in their hand, they know that they have touched something hot, right? So these are all the conditions which we have to be careful and advise the patients accordingly. So in case of neuropraxia, low energy injury, and a pure motor or sensory nerve, we usually don't go for surgical management. We usually do conservative management. And when surgical management is done, that is because when we see that the nerve is actually divided in case of presentation, like the laceration picture which we saw. In case of complete laceration of the nerve, there is no use in waiting for the nerve to recover by itself. We have to do some type of repair for that nerve, or when the clinical presentation suggests division. I can give you a scenario here. The patient comes with a mid-third distal third fracture of the humerus. And if you see the X-ray, that there is a sharp spike of the bone, which is a very, there is a high chance that this spike would have cut the radial nerve at the level of the spiral groove. And the patient has got complete radial nerve palsy. So when you have a clinic, but there is no open wound here. Are you able to understand? There is no open wound like a laceration, but the X-ray has a doubt that the X-ray shows that there is a possibility of the sharp bone spike which has injured the nerve. In those cases, we need not wait and we have to go for conservative, surgigical management. And whenever there is expected delay in the recovery, like the static tinal sign, when we subsequently follow the patient and we have a static tinal sign and there is no progression of the motor supply or the sensory supply, in those cases we go for surgical management. And when there is also delayed recovery with conservative management. And these are the indications for surgical management. What we do, the options are primary repair. Either at the time of presentation itself, if there is a complete laceration, you go and do a nerve graft or primary end-to-end repair or any other form of surgical repair of the nerve. If there is, then comes the delayed repair, which is usually done if the patient comes late. The patient would have had an injury about 30 days back and they didn't approach to us. They came to us, or the first presentation of the patient itself was late, or if there had been missed diagnosis. The patient would have gone to a non-specialty person who didn't recognize the nerve injury initially and treated it in other means. And once they approached us, then we could have elicited the nerve injury. And these are all the reasons. And one other reason is the failed primary repair. There are chances where the primary repair which was done didn't work actually. In those cases, we do a delayed repair. And I'm not going into the depth of what are the surgical options. This is the basic concept. There are various nerve repair techniques which are given in textbook, and I think you don't need the depth of them. When it comes to your clinical examination, you need to know which case needs conservative management, which case needs surgical management. So we either do primary repair or do delayed repair. Right? So what are the signs of recovery? There should be return of sensation, and there is another phenomenon called motor march, or innervation of the muscle immediately distal to the lesion. Now I think we will discuss this when we go for the radial nerve proper. Now we'll come to radial nerve palsy proper. Now with regards to this basic principles in nerve injury, is there any doubt? Should I clarify on anything? Anybody has any doubts in this basic understanding of nerve injuries? I think I see 60 people are online. Since all cameras and mics are muted, I'm not able to know who's listening and who is not. This is the problem with online presentation. Anybody? Any doubts?
No, sir.
Okay, fine. Then we'll shift on to presentation again. Now, before we go on to this topic, I want one volunteer to tell me the radial nerve anatomy. What is the radial nerve anatomy? Starting from which part and ending where? Anybody? Any volunteer? Okay, if you don't want to give the radial anatomy incomplete, at least tell me from its origin up to the spiral groove. Anyone?
Sir,
Yeah.
the radial nerve arises from the posterior cord of brachial plexus, sir,
Good.
and it then goes into the axilla posterior to the axillary artery, sir,
Very good.
and it supplies the triceps long head and lateral head, sir.
Okay, fine. Very good.
And then it descends along the humerus in the radial groove, sir.
Okay.
And then as it descends, it will wrap the humerus along the lateral side,
Okay.
and it is accompanied by the brachial arteries along the medial head of triceps brachii.
Yeah. Is it the brachial artery? Actually, there is an artery. You are right. What brachial artery? Is it not the-
Profunda breath.
Yeah. Good.
Deep branch.
Good. It is not the brachial artery proper. It is the profunda branch of the brachial artery. Good. Then, yeah. Then what happens?
Sir, then it enters the forearm, sir, through by traveling anterior to the lateral epicondyle through
Very
the
good.
cubital fossa.
Yeah.
And then it divides into two branches, giving its deep branch and superficial branch, sir.
Okay.
Deep branch is motor and superficial branch is sensory, sir.
Very good.
Uh,
Okay. What is another name of the deep branch? Anybody? Is there another very common?
Posterior interosseous.
Very good. It is called the PIN, posterior interosseous nerve. Okay. Fine. What happens to this posterior interosseous nerve after arising from the radial nerve proper?
Pierces the interosseous membrane.
Okay. Actually, it doesn't pierce the interosseous membrane. It actually passes through two heads of the supinator muscle, and it winds around the radial neck. The radial nerve proper winds around the humerus, and the posterior interosseous nerve winds around the neck of radial bone, right? Neck of radius. and then it goes into the posterior compartment, and then it lies on the interosseous membrane, on the posterior aspect. That is why it is called the posterior interosseous membrane. Fine. And then what happens next? So it has pierced the supinator, winding around the radial neck and entering the posterior compartment of forearm, and lies on the posterior interosseous membrane. And then anybody? It descends along the posterior interosseous membrane, supplying the extensors of forearm, right? Extensors of wrist, actually. Extensor muscles of the wrist, which are situated in the forearm. And it ends as a pseudoganglion. Fine. And what happens to the superficial radial nerve? After its origin from the radial nerve proper.
Divides into 4 branches, sir.
Okay. You mean to say the superficial radial nerve divides into 4 branches? Is it so?
A 3 branch in the forearm, and the terminal part is the superficial branch, the terminal division.
Okay, fine. Fine. I think we'll go to the presentation, and we'll have a continued discussion here. So, what is expected in the exam? See, the first point which is expected in the exam is you should know the radial nerve anatomy thoroughly. That is why I stopped here, and I wanted to know how well you can recollect the radial nerve anatomy. See, in case of a final year orthopedic exam, without knowing the radial nerve anatomy, please don't enter the exam hall. You can make mistakes in eliciting the findings. You can make mistakes in arriving at the diagnosis. And it is even okay if you don't even tell management plan. But if you make mistakes in describing the radial nerve anatomy, then I think you won't be pardoned. The examiner won't forgive you, and that can lead to drastic or catastrophic consequences, right? So please always read the radial nerve anatomy before coming to the exam, and even before seeing a case, you just revise your radial nerve anatomy. And this anatomy is very relevant when you know the exact type or exact lesion of the radial nerve anatomy. We'll shortly see why. Now, why the anatomy is important? Because there are 3 broad types of radial nerve palsy. One is the low palsy, another is the high palsy, and the third type is very high palsy. There is some crossover between the high and very high with regards to textbooks. Some textbook usually say it confusing, but if you remember this way with regards to clinical examination, usually there is no confusion. A low palsy, high palsy, and a very high palsy. We'll see each of them now. And you need to know what is the severity of the injury, and it would be best if you are able to give a plan of management for that particular patient. So this is how we describe the radial nerve anatomy. Like you said, another name for radial nerve is musculospiral nerve. So the nerve roots are from C5 to T1, and all these points you have very clearly given. This arises from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus, and this is the largest branch of brachial plexus. Radial nerve is the largest branch of brachial plexus, and this is primarily motor nerve. This is not a pure motor nerve. This is primarily motor nerve, and it also has sensory components, but majority of the nerve fibers are motor. So, like you said, it starts from the axilla, posterior to the axillary artery, right? And it gives on branches to the medial head of triceps, lateral head, long head, and there are 2 sensory branches here: posterior brachial cutaneous nerve and posterior cutaneous, the outer cutaneous nerve of lower third of the arm. And this is the spiral groove. Here it descends along the profunda brachii artery, and here the radial nerve proper gives branches to the brachioradialis, extensor radialis, and divides into, this is the posterior interosseous nerve, and this is the superficial radial nerve, and this is the dorsal cutaneous nerve of the forearm. Okay, so the sensory branches are to the posterior aspect of the arm, posterior aspect of the forearm, and the posterior aspect of the hand. The sensory branch to the arm is above the spiral groove, Below the spiral groove, it gives the posterior cutaneous nerve of the forearm, and then the hand dorsal supply is by the superficial radial nerve. This is a sensory, pure sensory nerve, and the posterior interosseous nerve is a pure motor nerve which supplies all these muscles in the extensor compartment of the forearm or the dorsal compartment of forearm. Okay. Now you need to understand this anatomy in order to further know what happens in case of each type of radial nerve injury based on this particular anatomy. Now first we will see what is low radial nerve palsy. In case of low radial nerve palsy, the lesion is very commonly located at the level of neck of radius in this part, right? Do you all agree that this is the level where the neck of radius is situated? So there can be any compression or fracture hematoma or a displaced bone which can cause damage to the posterior interosseous nerve, but there can also be damage from here to here. It is not very strictly that the location should be only in the radial neck region, anywhere starting from the bifurcation until it exits after piercing the supinator. So from here to here, anywhere the damage can happen, and this specifically affects the posterior interosseous nerve, and the superficial interosseous nerve and the dorsal sensation or the dorsal cutaneous nerve of the forearm is still intact. So you will have problem only with the posterior interosseous nerve. This is called low radial nerve palsy. Any doubts in this? Is it clear? With regards to low radial nerve palsy, only the posterior interosseous nerve component is affected. Now, what are the problems you can have? You can have weakness in the extension of the wrist. There is loss of extension of metacarpophalangeal joint. There is loss of extension and retroposition of the thumb, and there is no sensory loss. Now, if you are, I can tell you a way to easily remember this. You remember all radial nerve pathology as drops. What are the drops you can see? You can see a thumb drop. See, this is thumb. Are you able to see my hand? Is my hand visible to all? Yeah, because I am not able to see what I am just seeing the presentation in my computer screen. I am not able to see what I am projecting actually, right? So is my hand clear?
Yes,
Once
sir.
again, fine. So with regards to thumb, this is extension, right? Flexion, extension. So there is loss of extension of the thumb. This is known as thumb drop. The thumb is not able to extend. The thumb is not able to extend. This is, we call it as thumb drop. With regards to metacarpophalangeal joint, this is metacarpophalangeal joint action, flexion, extension. So in case of posterior interosseous nerve palsy, there is absence of extension or loss of extension. So this is finger drop, thumb drop, this is thumb drop, this is finger drop, and then comes the wrist joint. See, this is the, if you say this is the neutral position, this is extension or dorsiflexion, palmar flexion. There is loss or weakness of extension. This is called as wrist drop. So what are the drops you have seen till now? Thumb drop, finger drop, wrist drop. There is also another thing known as the elbow drop. See, this is extension of the elbow. Are you able to see my elbow?
Yes, sir.
Fine. So this is extension of elbow. When this is not possible and you hold the position here, the elbow drops. This is elbow drop. So these are the drops possible in radial nerve palsy: thumb drop, finger drop, wrist drop, and elbow drop. Is this clear? Anybody wants me to repeat it again? Anybody wants me to repeat it again? If you understand these drops, then we can clearly identify the level of lesion. I'll do it once again. Thumb drop, finger drop, wrist drop, and elbow drop. Fine. So with regards to low radial nerve palsy, we all know from the anatomy that posterior interosseous nerve is a pure motor nerve. There is no sensory supply here. So this point, you should not have any doubt here. There will not be any sensory loss in posterior interosseous nerve palsy. And there is loss of extension and retroposition of thumb. So there is low extension, there is thumb drop. And the MCP joints, there is no extension, there is finger drop. Now you should understand the difference between loss and weakness. See, here usually there is no wrist drop. See, I have not given it as loss of extension. I have given it as weakness in extension. This is because extension of the wrist is most commonly caused by extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis. Now, with regards to nerve supply, you can see that the extensor carpi radialis longus muscle is actually supplied by the radial nerve proper and not by the posterior interosseous nerve. You can see that the posterior interosseous nerve supplies the extensor carpi radialis brevis. Is this clear now? Is the concept clear here? So, the extensor carpi radialis brevis is lost, but still the extensor carpi radialis longus can act. So, when you compare the opposite side, there will be weakness in extension, but there won't be a drop. See, this is wrist extension. This is wrist drop. But in case of low palsy, the patient will be able to do some amount of wrist extension and there won't be a drop. Is this clear? Does anybody want me to repeat it again? The biggest trouble is I'm not able to see the student's face, and because once I teach them in person, I will be from their faces, I will be able to understand whether my message is clear to them. That is the biggest problem in this online class. I'm not able to assess whether the message is conveyed clear. Does anybody want me to repeat it?
It's clear, sir.
Fine. So I assume everybody has understood this concept. The ECRL is still intact in case of a low radial nerve palsy. So you won't have a wrist drop, but there will be some weakness with extension of the wrist, right? Now there are some other confusing facts as well. What are they? Now thumb abduction is also caused by APB. There are two thumb abductors. Thumb abductor pollicis longus, abductor pollicis brevis. Hope you all remember this in anatomy. Right? Thumb abduction is caused by two different muscles, abductor pollicis longus, or which we call it as APL, and the other muscle is abductor pollicis brevis, which is supplied by the median nerve. Now, with regards to thumb abduction, technically we call it as two different. One thing is, if this is the plane of the palm, this is also abduction, and this is also abduction. We call it as radial abduction, palmar abduction. See, don't get confused this with extension. This is flexion, this is extension. But this is radial abduction, this is palmar abduction. Is this clear to all? Because people usually get confused which is extension, which is abduction in thumb. And this is one commonly asked question in your clinical exam. When the candidate is having some difficulty in presenting the case, usually the examiner will say, okay, I will give you a pass if you show me thumb abduction correctly. So you should know what is thumb abduction, right? Thumb abduction can happen in two different directions: radial abduction, palmar abduction. This is extension, flexion, extension. That is different. Is it clear to all?
Yes, sir.
Good. So, if suppose the examiner is asking you to demonstrate loss of thumb abduction in case of radial nerve palsy, you should not ask the patient to do this movement, because he will be able to do it because the abductor pollicis brevis is intact, but he won't be able to do this movement. The radial abduction will not be there because that is, you can see the tendon here. This is the abductor pollicis longus tendon. So that causes radial abduction, whereas this tendon is on the front aspect, abductor pollicis brevis. So this is one confusing concept or a trap question in case of a radial nerve palsy, where the candidate can commit mistake. So don't do this. Another thing is, which I already explained, the wrist extension can be done by ECRL because it is supplied by the radial nerve proper. Now, is this clear? Is this slide clear? This is complete about low radial nerve palsy. Right? There is no loss of sensation. There is thumb drop. There is finger drop. There is weakness of wrist extension. Remaining aspect of the radial nerve is intact. Hope there are no confusions here. Now we will move on to high radial nerve palsy. Here, the problem is, it can happen anywhere after the supply of the posterior cutaneous branch of the arm and the division. from here to here. The damage can be anywhere, right? And usually it is happening at the level of the spiral groove. This is known as the high radial nerve palsy. Now, you can have your low radial nerve palsy as a foundation, and you can add some findings to it. Then you get high radial nerve palsy. You will know why. Because in low radial nerve palsy, you had thumb drop, you had finger drop, but there was weak extension possible. Here, ECRL is also lost. Extensor radial is longest is also lost. So there will be definite wrist drop. Are you able to understand that?
Yes, sir.
Good. So you add one finding to low radial nerve palsy and you get high radial nerve palsy. So if there is definite wrist drop, then it is high radial nerve palsy. And what other feature you can add? Because the superficial radial nerve is also not functioning, there will be loss of sensation of the hand. Right? Can anybody tell me what is the prime area for supply of the radial nerve? Which area you will check with regards to sensation to show that the superficial radial nerve is functioning or not? Anybody?
A lateral side of the posterior aspect of hand.
Sorry, can you come again, please?
Lateral side of the posterior aspect of hand.
Lateral side of posterior aspect of hand. Okay. Then even more refined answer.
Dorsal.
You are correct. You are correct. Sorry.
Dorsal.
Sir, near
aspect of-
anatomical snuff box.
Okay. See, this is anatomical snuff box.
2.5.
This one. Sorry.
Dorsal aspect of that lateral 2.5 fingers.
Yeah, what you are saying is the sensory supply of radial nerve. That I'm not contesting. I'm not saying that is wrong. But there is a prime area or what to say, a pure
First web space.
Yeah, first web space. One more word to it. Just one more word to it. Dorsal aspect of first web space. That is the answer. This region, right? Because there can be anatomical variations with regards to supply of the fingers. So you call it as the autonomous zone. So this is the area which is definitely not supplied by any other nerve except the radial nerve. So the triangle shaped region on the dorsal aspect of the first web space. So if the sensation is intact here, then radial nerve or the superficial radial nerve is intact. If the sensation is lost here, then the superficial radial nerve is lost. There is no ambiguity in this clinical finding. Is it clear to everyone? See, the answer you gave is correct. It supplies the lateral 2.5 of the fingers. That and all I agree. But the autonomous zone is the first dorsal web space. So this is the region where you check for pure sensory function of the superficial radial nerve. Is it clear? Any doubts on this? Any doubts from anybody?
No, sir.
Okay. See, all the answers you gave are correct. I'm not saying they are wrong. But there is an autonomous zone that needs to be specifically checked for radial nerve. That is my message here. So, the lesion is at the level of spiral groove. There is loss of extension. In the previous slide, if you remember, I had not written it as loss. I wrote it as weakness in wrist extension, but here it is loss of extension. There is loss of extension of MCP as well and thumb as well. And the sensory loss is first dorsal web space or intermetacarpal space. Okay. So here, once again, for the sake of, I'm sorry, I'm repeating it too many times. The message here is don't get confused. Only if you are clear in eliciting these findings, then you will get your diagnosis right. There is thumb drop, finger drop, wrist drop, and loss of sensation in the first dorsal web space. If all these findings are there, then the lesion is at the level of the spiral groove, just above and below it. So this we call it as high radial nerve palsy. And see, this is complete wrist drop. The opposite side, the patient is able to do active extension, whereas there is no wrist extension possible on the affected side. This is wrist drop. And this was the answer given by one candidate. The lateral, almost 2.5 fingers is supplied by the radial nerve. This is distribution of the superficial branch, but various anatomy textbook gives a different presentation, right? Some says even this part of the ring finger is also by the radial nerve. Certain textbooks says that way. But this triangle region is the autonomous zone. There is no crossover of nerve supply from other peripheral nerves to this region. So if there is loss here, the loss is definitely by the radial nerve. There won't be any ambiguity in the clinical finding. Okay. Now we'll move on to very high radial nerve palsy. Can anybody tell me which drop will be here and which sensory loss will be there?
Elbow
Just
drop.
very good, very good, very good, excellent. So here the level of lesion is at the level of axilla, right? It can happen because of open wound in the axilla, any cut injury, a traction injury, anything which causes traction of the posterior cord will give rise to very high radial nerve palsy. So to the drops which we saw previously, you add elbow drop and sensation of the entire radial nerve is lost. So sensation of the arm, sensation of the forearm, and sensation of the hand. The entire dorsal aspect of the upper limb is, there is no touch sensation present. Touch, or for that matter, sensation is complete. There are many modalities of sensation. For the common sensation we elicit is touch. Maybe a temperature sensation by using hot and cold water test tubes. But commonly we elicit touch. So touch sensation is lost in posterior aspect of the arm, forearm, and the hand. So entire sensation is lost, and all drops are present, including elbow drop. So lesion is at the level of axilla. There is loss of elbow extension, wrist extension, MCP extension, thumb extension, and entire radial nerve territory. There is no sensation. So this is very high radial nerve palsy. So these are all the sensory distribution areas of the radial nerve. See in this picture, this is also taken from an anatomy textbook. You can see that even the lateral half of the ring finger is supplied with radial nerve. There is some crossover happening here. So this is the ambiguity nature of crossover of sensation between the radial and ulnar nerve. But the dorsal, this is an autonomous zone for radial nerve. Just remember that point. So there is loss of sensation of the lower half of the arm, the posterior aspect of the forearm, and the hand. Right? All sensation, the sensation in all these regions is lost, then the lesion is at very high radial nerve palsy. Now, summing it up in one tabular column. If the finger drop is present, it can happen in all type of radial nerve palsy. So, which is weak? If the wrist drop is weak, then it is elbow radial nerve palsy. But if it is complete, then it is high radial nerve palsy. The elbow drop is not there, it cannot be very high radial nerve palsy. But when the elbow drop is there, definitely it is high radial nerve palsy, very high radial nerve palsy. No sensation, it is low. Only the first dorsal web space is lost, then it is high. If all radial nerve area is lost, then it is very high radial nerve palsy. Is this tabular column clear to everyone? Because the subdivision of the radial nerve palsy is presented in this one tabular column, concised format. Based on the drops and based on the area of loss of sensation, you will be able to classify which type of radial nerve palsy that particular patient is having. Any doubts in this tabular column? Because this is one important concept which you need to understand clearly without any doubts. Does anybody want me to repeat any concept, any point which I have discussed till now? Okay, I assume there is no doubts. And this is the condition which we discussed previously. See, Saturday night palsy need not be only because of sleeping over. See, this is the typical Saturday night palsy, right? And this is also Saturday night palsy. But what pathology you expect if the compression is at this level? Which type of radial nerve palsy you expect in this picture? Anybody?
Very high. Very
Sorry?
high. Very
Exactly.
high.
Very good, very good. So in this type of Saturday night palsy, if the patient is drunk and sleeps on a chair with his axilla getting compressed by this part of the chair, you will get a very high radial nerve palsy. Whereas like this, What type of radial nerve palsy you get here?
High.
High.
High radial nerve palsy, because here the compression will be at the level of the spiral groove. This is also Saturday night palsy, right? And there is something also called as honeymoon palsy, where the partner sleeps on the arm of the another partner, and this can also cause compression. And see here, the entire arm is getting compressed by the mattress. And this is another very not very common, but maybe if you appear for some medal examination in orthopedics, this type of cases can be there. It is very rare to get such a case, but still it is a possible clinical scenario. Wartenberg syndrome. This is nothing but isolated superficial radial nerve palsy. Here there is no motor loss at all. The only clinical finding is the first dorsal web space. There is no sensory supply. Right? There are many reasons to it. I don't want to go into the details of this. Most commonly during dissection or during post-operative exposure of the forearm, patients can have loss of sensation in this particular region. This is called as Wartenberg syndrome. Just for sake of added knowledge, right? You won't get this case in your clinical examination because it is very rare to get such a case. But still, there is a syndrome for isolated superficial radial nerve palsy. And this one slide, what to say? It consolidates all the management needed for radial nerve palsy. This may be confusing. I think you have to go back, read about radial nerve palsy, and then come back to this slide and read it again and again. Maybe after 2 or 3 revisions, you will be able to understand what is given here. For the sake of completion, I will just read it. You have a radial nerve palsy. You know which type it is, because this doesn't depend on the type. This is for all types. If it is an open injury, you have an open laceration where the nerve is torn or the nerve is damaged, the immediate management is immediate repair. You go do an immediate repair. And what you do next, you splint and wait for 12 weeks time and you observe for recovery. If there is no recovery, you follow up the patient with EMG potentials, right? Either you can get 2 results. You can get active potentials, you can get denervation potentials. If there is still denervation potentials, go for nerve exploration, right? And you go back here, nerve exploration, you start here. Now, in case of a closed injury on presentation, I mean, closed injury, but immediate presentation and delayed presentation. If there is immediate presentation, and if it is a closed injury, it is not necessary to immediately open and see what is happening to the nerve, except one case where the Halston-Lewis fracture, where we are justified in opening the fracture site and to be sure that the nerve, the bone spike has not cut the radial nerve. Otherwise, in all other cases, you can splint and wait for 12 weeks, right? And you again follow this chart. Now, suppose if there is recovering, if you splint and wait and you see signs of recovery, you wait till complete recovery. And if full recovery is achieved, the patient is happy, we are happy. But if there is incomplete recovery, then you go for salvage procedures. And again, if there is also delayed presentation, then you can go for nerve exploration. See, to explain this one particular slide in 5 minutes is very difficult. I think I will share the presentation to you. You go back, spend some time, and you follow this with regards to various category of patients who may come to your clinic. And based on that particular patient and which diagnosis the patient fits into, whether it is open, closed. If it is closed, whether it is immediate presentation or delayed presentation. But all concepts are consolidated in one particular slide. Now, another important point is how long can you wait? This is one common question asked in the examination. You say that this is a closed injury and we can splint and wait. But the next question from the examiner will be, how long will you wait? Here I have given it as wait for 12 weeks. But even 20 weeks, yes, you can wait. 24 weeks, yes, you can wait. But how long can you wait? The maximum waiting time is 2 years. Now, why 2 years? Because 2 years is the time period till which the muscle or the target organ will be viable enough to receive the nerve supply. Is the concept clear? Right? 2 years is the maximum time the end organ. For example, the problem is at the axilla and the extensor muscles are in the forearm, or the thumb muscle is in the forearm. the distance for the nerve recovery from here to here. If it is 23 centimeter, the nerve has to travel. How long will it take? 230 days. That is the minimum time taken for the nerve to recover, starting from the level of lesion to supply the muscle. Right? Now, if it is, how many days we have in 2 years? Can anybody tell me? Simple mathematics. How many days is there in 2 years?
730.
Good. You can wait for 730 days. Otherwise, when that many mm of nerve damage, or what to say, 730, 100 mm is 1 centimeter, right? You can calculate. So, if suppose you assess the patient, you know that, for example, if you take the sciatic nerve from the hip to the toe, how long is the nerve tract? In such situations, you cannot wait for such a long duration, because you definitely know that by the time the nerve recovers and reaches the target organ would have already atrophied. And there is no use in waiting for such cases. In those cases, you should not wait. You should intervene. Either you can do a tendon graft, you can do a muscle graft, or whatever methods. But up to 2 years, you can wait. Is this concept clear? Is the message clear here? Because this question is very commonly asked in clinical examination. Because usually you see a case of radial nerve palsy, you give your diagnosis right, and you say, for this case, I will just splint and wait. The next question will be, how long will you wait? The answer is maximum 2 years. I can wait for a period of maximum 2 years. Beyond that, there is no chance of recovery, because the reason is the end organ, which was originally supplied by the nerve, would have gone for complete atrophy. Right? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
So what are the splinting options we have? Now there are 3 different types of splint. This is a static splint, which is given for wrist drop, finger drop, and thumb drop. So this is used for in case of high radial nerve palsy, right? Where the wrist is supported in case of neutral or on slight dorsiflexion. The MCP is supported in dorsiflexion and the thumb is supported in dorsiflexion. And this is here there is no active movement possible in this type of splint. Here there is some movement possible at the level of MCP, because you have rubber strings here. The patient's hand will be maintained here, but still he will be able to flex it, because your flexors are intact. They are supplied by the ulnar and median nerve. Though the wrist is maintained in dorsiflexion, the patient will be able to close his hand and open it. Right? Now, why we need to do this? Because we need to keep the joint supple until the recovery is complete. Because if you leave it in that way, you will have a wrist drop here, and all your flexor muscles will go in for contracture. And after complete nerve recovery, even if the nerve recovers, the movement will not be possible, because the joint would have fused by then. There would have been stiffness developed in the joint, and all the contractures here would have become irreparable even after complete recovery. So that is the reason you give a splint to maintain it in neutral position. And this is an added advantage. Here you can see that even wrist extension is also maintained. There are springs here as well as here. So the wrist is in dorsiflexion. By using his forearm flexors, he will be able to do this movement. Right? So these are the 3 different types of splint. The commonly accepted answer is either a cock-up splint, which can be static cock-up splint here, or a dynamic cock-up splint. Fine? Do you understand the concept of splint here? Because this will be the most commonly answer which is accepted in clinical examinations. Any doubts here?
Sir, so splint, we should give splint to like compensate the action lost, sir?
Exactly. You see, if you see this picture, it supports the wrist in dorsiflexion, it supports the MCPs in dorsiflexion, it supports the rim in dorsiflexion or neutral position. That is accepted, because if you leave it in dropped position, your flexors will go in for contraction. You understand this?
Okay, sir.
But this is a cheaper splint where the patient will not be able to do the action of the intact muscles. Whereas this is a costlier splint where, though the wrist is maintained in dorsiflexion, the patient can still exercise his flexors. And this picture is an advancement of this. We have added wrist dorsiflexion as well. Right? that can be moved. Are you able to understand?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So now, like we discussed earlier, you have waited for 2 years and still there is no recovery. Then what will you do next? So these are the tendon transfers which can be done in case of a radial nerve palsy. Now, there are, I think I can say there are more than 6 or 7 named procedures in radial nerve, in tendon transfers for radial nerve palsy. But there are 3 important actions which are lost and which needs to be regained in case of radial nerve palsy. The most common action is the thumb abduction. See, if you want to take any object, if your thumb is already dropped, you won't be able to grip it. See, if I want to pick up this object, I want my thumb to go in for abduction and I will hold it with flexion and then take it. If suppose the thumb is already in adducted position, how will I hold it? Right? So thumb abduction is important. Even your MCP extension, if I want to hold an object which is very big, suppose you consider this as an object, and if there is no MCP extension possible, how will I hold it? So I need my MCP extension to go grip it and then take it, right? And I want wrist extension as well, because wrist extension is very important for proper tensioning of the flexor muscles. Now to understand this, I think I can hope you all would have seen some action sequences in movies, in cinemas, where maybe the villain has a knife in his hand and he tries to attack the hero with his knife. And you must have seen the hero will grasp here and do this, and immediately the knife will drop. Have you all seen this scene in a movie?
Yes, sir.
I think at least you have not seen previously. From this point, if you are watching some action sequence in a movie, most commonly this scene will be there, where the assailant or the villain has a weapon in his hand. The protagonist or the hero grasps the wrist of the assailant and he does wrist drop, or he creates a wrist drop, and immediately you see your hands will open. You can even try it right now in your hand. See, your grip strength will be maximum only when there is some amount of wrist extension, but your grip strength will be reduced slowly when you do palmar flexion. See, naturally my fingers will get opened out here. You can even try right now. That is because for complete muscle power or maximum muscle power, there is some amount of pre-tensioning that is required in the muscles. This is an anatomy and physiology. There is some amount of pre-tensioning. Now, if you do dorsiflexion, the flexors of the forearm are subjected to some amount of tensioning, and when they contract, now the grip strength is maximum. You will be able to hold any object very tightly. But when there is a wrist drop, there is loss of this pre-tensioning, and therefore the grip strength is naturally reduced. Now, try holding your wrist in this maximum palmar flex position and try holding a fist. You can even try it right now. Can any one of you turn on your camera and show me? Any one of you? At least I'll be happy that I'm able to convey this message to you all. Can any one volunteer turn on your camera so that even others can see? Yeah.
Is my hand visible?
Yeah, visible. Yeah.
So when I
See? Yeah. When you do maximum palmar flexion, the grip strength is reduced. Are you able to feel it?
Yes, sir.
But when you have the wrist and dorsiflexion, your grip strength will be maximum. Good. Thank you. We'll go on to the presentation again. Right. So these are the primary actions which are needed in case of a patient with very poor recovery from radial nerve palsy. You have splintered him, you have waited for 2 years, still there is no recovery. Then you go in for these methods, tendon transfer, right? For thumb abduction, you use the palmaris longus and divert it to the abductor pollicis longus. For MCP extension, you can use FCR, which is applied by the median nerve, and you can divert it to the extensor digitorum tendon for MCP extension. You can use the pronator teres for wrist extension and transfer it to the extensor carpi, radialis brevis. These three transfers are the basic concept, but there are many named procedure, branch transfer. There are many different surgeons who have developed their own methods and have named it after them, right? And it is very hard to remember all those. But the concept is this: for thumb, you need thumb abduction, you need MCP extension and wrist extension. So these are all the muscles which are very commonly used, because these muscles can be sacrificed, because there are some other muscles which can do this action. See, the pronator teres can also be done by pronator quadratus. The action of pronator teres can also be done by pronator quadratus. FCR can be done by all other flexors and FCU. The palmaris longus, again, palmar flexion can be compensated by other muscles. So these are all expendable muscles which can be sacrificed, and their action can be used to supply or used to compensate another muscle which is completely lost because of radial nerve palsy. So for sake of repetition, palmaris longus to abductor pollicis longus, FCR to extensor digitorum, pronator teres to ECRB. So these are all the tendon transfers which a patient may need if the already maximum waiting period of 2 years has elapsed. Fine. Okay, time for doubts. We finished in 1 hour 15 minutes.
Sir, Saturday night palsy, what do we do? So what's the treatment?
Okay. Now, can I ask you, what is the type of nerve damage in case of Saturday night palsy with regards to Sedens and Sunderland? Good. It is a compression. And what usually it is a compression of about overnight, right? So
Yes,
what
sir.
do you expect? Will the axon be damaged here?
Neuropraxia.
Very good. In Saturday night palsy, the damage is neuropraxia, which is a conduction block. Because of compression, there is transient conduction block happening there, but still the axon is intact, the endoneurium is intact, perineurium, epineurium, everything is intact. So there is very good recovery potential, right? So usually it recovers by 12 weeks, that is 3 months, or by 24 weeks. You say you can wait even up to 6 months, but it definitely recovers before 2 years time. Have I answered your doubt?
So conservative management only.
Exactly. Most commonly, this is the case kept in your exam, right?
Okay, sir.
So you will have a case of Saturday night palsy, but you will need to say for sure where is the level of lesion, whether it is a low palsy, high palsy, or a very high palsy, right? Because that differentiates what type of splint this patient will need. Okay, and you know it is neuropraxia. Definitely, this patient will recover if you just splint and wait. Slowly, if suppose during the next visit, suppose not in the exam scenario, you see a patient in your future clinic, you know this is neuropraxia and you know the level of lesion. And if it is a low level lesion, definitely by next month time, the muscle, which is immediately distal to the level of block, would have recovered motor power. For example, in case of, if the level of lesion is at the level of, the level of lesion is at the elbow, and brachioradialis is the first muscle after the spiral groove, right? No, I think I'm confusing it. Okay, we will assume the level of lesion is at the spiral groove. Is it clear? The level of lesion is at the spiral groove, and what do we call it?
High radial palsy.
High radial nerve palsy. So at the time of presentation, the patient has got no brachioradialis power. See, this is the action of brachioradialis. You cause resistance to elbow flexion. You can see that the bulge of the muscle building up. Initially, this was not there, but after 1 month time, still this patient will have wrist drop. Still the patient will have wrist drop. But if you check for brachioradialis, his muscle will be functioning now. That shows that the nerve has recovered from the level of lesion and it has advanced distally, right? So it is definitely growing back.
This is motor march, sir.
This is motor march. Very good. This is motor march. Right? And since it is only neuropraxia, definitely he will recover. Need not worry. But the thing is, you have to convey this message to the patient. We can wait even up to a maximum of 2 years. So by this time, mostly all patients recover.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Fine. Any other doubts?
So, isn't surgery a safer bet to make rather than wait for more than 1 year?
Sorry?
Isn't surgery a safer bet? So, the chances of recovery are guaranteed rather than
Okay.
waiting for more than 1 or 2 years
Fine.
for recovery.
Fine. I get your question. I think I will make you answer to this question. What do you think we are going to achieve by surgery? See, for example, if there is a fracture of the forearm, there is fracture of the ulna, you fix it with a plate and screws. You achieve continuity, and immediately the patient will be able to move. No doubt in it. Is there any doubt?
No, sir.
Good. But in case of nerve injury, you are just restoring the anatomical continuity. You are doing nothing else. You can't make an axon function. Neurological recovery is different from bony recovery, is different from vascular anastomosis. See, with regards to vascular anastomosis, if there is tear in a particular vessel, you do an end-to-end repair and you remove the clamps here and here, the blood flow is immediately established. Are you able to understand this?
Yes, sir.
But neurological recovery is not as simple as this. Neurological recovery is complex. That is why any nerve damage or for the given issue, any problem starting from your brain till your nerve supply to the toe, what maximum you can do is you can achieve an anatomical continuity. See, if there is a laceration in the radial nerve, you do an end-to-end repair. You cannot expect the nerve to function immediately following the repair, like you would expect in case of a repair of radial artery. If there is a tear in the radial artery, you do an end-to-end repair, you release the clamps, immediately blood flows. But nerve recovery is not like that. Even after radial nerve repair, the nerve takes the same physiological healing. The axon has to grow from up, axon has to go down, and then reach the end organ, right? So even with surgery, you are not going to return his function immediately. That is my message to you. This is not as simple as you repair a artery or a bone. Have I answered your question now? So in
Yes.
that scenario, we can definitely wait and give nature its own time. See, we have to intervene only if we have a doubt that the nerve will be completely lacerated or there is some other anatomical structure which is pressing on the nerve. In that cases, you need not wait. But for all other cases, you can definitely wait. Am I clear to you?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Fine. Okay. Hope I have conveyed the message clearly. Because I can do this better in case of a physical class, but it's very tough in online class.
Sir,
Yeah.
what is conservation treatment, sir?
Sorry.
What is conservation treatment? What we do in conservation?
That was what we were discussing so long. We just splint the joint to prevent it from going into contracture and we wait for recovery. That is conservative management, nothing else. You put him on a splint. If you leave the limb hanging, like I said, your flexors will go in for contracture. Even if the nerve recovers, the patient will not have any function in the hand. Then there is no use, right? So you give him a splint and wait. This is conservative management. Am I clear?
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Fine. Anything else? Any
Sir,
other doubts? Yeah.
sir, I was not able to see your video, sir. So once again, can you explain me the thumb abduction and the foot drop? I mean, the drops, various drops. Just show me the
Okay.
position of.
Are you able to see my hand now?
Now I'm able to see, sir.
Okay. See, now the thumb is in adducted position, right? There are two different abductions possible in thumb. If you consider this as the plane of thumb, this is palmar abduction, right? If you consider this plane, this aspect, this is radial abduction. Is it clear now?
Okay, sir.
Right? This is palmar abduction. This is radial abduction. This is flexion. This is extension. You need to understand this because this metacarpal, the first metacarpal articulates with which bone here? Which carpal bone this first metacarpal articulates? Okay, I think that I can give it as a homework to you. You go and find out. Right? See, human hand is very different from hand of other animals. The thumb has evolved to come to lie in a different plane when compared to the rest of fingers. This is possible only in case of primates, starting from the apes. For all other animals, the thumb is in the same plane as the other fingers. Whereas for the primates, evolutionary development, because we use more our hands for other functions rather than walking. If you just examine the any other animal, the upper limbs are also used for walking. They don't use upper limb for any other aspect, right? Is it clear?
Okay, sir.
But the primates, starting from the apes, we have evolved to use our thumb differently from other animals. So this joint, the first carpo-metacarpal joint, has shifted to a different plane when compared to the other fingers. Therefore, this is flexion, this is extension, this is radial abduction, this is palmar abduction. Is it clear till now?
Yes, sir.
Fine. Now, this palmar abduction is caused by abductor pollicis brevis. This is supplied by the median nerve. Is it clear? Is it clear?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just a moment. Hello. மேலே எங்கள் செகண்ட் ஃப்ளோர் ஒரு கிளாஸு இவங்க யூஜி ஸ்டூடெண்ட்ஸ்க்கு ரேடியாலஜி சாரி இது ரேடியல் நர்வ் பால்சி வருது இன்சூரன்ஸ் ரூம் பக்கத்து ரூம் வாங்க. Where was I? Abductor pollicis brevis, right? So this is supplied by the abductor pollicis brevis. So the palmar abduction is by abductor pollicis brevis, whereas radial abduction, this is by abductor pollicis longus, which is supplied by the radial nerve. Is it clear now?
Yes, sir.
So whenever the examiner asks you to demonstrate thumb abduction in case of radial nerve palsy, don't do this movement. You have to do this movement. Because even in case of radial nerve palsy, this will be possible. And if you do this movement, the examiner will say, this patient doesn't, he is able to do that movement, and how do you say he has radial nerve palsy? So the anatomical reason here is the abductor pollicis brevis is supplied by the median nerve, and this does this palmar abduction. Whereas abductor pollicis longus does the radial abduction. Right. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So thumb drop is covered. Any doubts in thumb drop?
No, sir.
Fine. With regards to finger drop, this is the metacarpophalangeal joint, right? This is extension of MCP. This is flexion. Is it clear? Extension, flexion.
Yes, sir.
So your flexors are needed for, the extensors are needed for extension of MCP. Extensor are the muscles situated here, the dorsal compartment of forearm. So when they are lost, the attitude of the fingers will be this. This is finger drop. The patient will not be able to extend his fingers. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
So this is finger drop. Now when you come to the wrist, this is dorsiflexion, this is palmar flexion, this is neutral position. So whenever there is wrist drop, it will be like this. The patient, there won't be any active extension of the wrist. In case of a low radial nerve palsy, the extensor carpi radialis longus is still intact because that is supplied by the radial nerve proper. Therefore, in that case, the patient will have some amount of wrist extension, but he won't be able to reach this point. Is this clear?
Okay, sir.
So this is weakness of extension. This is not wrist drop. But when there is no movement at all and the hand is loosely hanging like this, without any attempt to dorsiflexion, this is a wrist drop. So this is possible in case of high radial nerve palsy. In low radial nerve palsy, wrist drop is not present. There is some amount of wrist extension possible because of the reason I said. Extensor carpadialis longus is intact. But when you go to high radial nerve palsy, everything is lost. So is it clear now? Is wrist drop clear?
Yes, sir. But why not the fingers flexed in the high or very high nerve palsy, sir? Why
Sorry?
the entire wrist is, like you told, the entire wrist is going for flexion?
Okay.
Why not the fingers? Fingers are applied just in extended position. I mean, at the metacarpophalangeal joint, why is it not going for flexion?
Why is it not going for flexions? I'm not able to understand your question. See, the loss here is extension, not flexion. Flexion is caused by the ulnar and median nerve.
Okay, sir.
These two nerves are intact. And still, I'm not able to understand your question. If you can turn on your camera and show me your hand, I think then I will understand.
Okay. Able to see
Yeah,
my
now it's-
hand, sir?
Just a minute. I'll maximize your window. Yeah, now I'm able to see. Yeah.
Like you told, it will be like this.
Yeah.
Why the fingers will not be like this? Like at the
Okay.
level of when the injury affects both the
Yeah,
are
yeah.
you
Take your
able to
time.
understand?
Take your time. Take your time. No, I'm not in a hurry. You can take your time. You want to say
See,
why the fingers are not like this?
yeah, though that part of the nerve is also injured.
Sir, at the MCP level, she's asking, I guess. Sir.
Yeah, good. Good. I think she's thinking in the correct direction. Now we'll answer your question. See, for this, we will start with the person whose hand is still intact. Now my hand is still intact, right? Now, you all know what is the normal resting position of the fingers. This is the neutral position, right? I'm not causing any movement in my fingers now. The moment I do dorsiflexion, you can see that the flexion of the fingers is increased. Do you all see this? You can even try it in your own hand. See, this is neutral position. The moment I try to do dorsiflexion maximally at the level of wrist, the amount of flexion in the fingers is increased. Can you turn on your camera? You can also show it to your friends. See, this is neutral position. You just do maximum dorsiflexion. You see that the amount of flexion in your MCP and IP joint is getting increased. But if you do the opposite, see, naturally your fingers will get extended. Do you all agree to this? The reason here is anatomy. The reason here is anatomy. See, when you do maximal dorsiflexion, the extensor, the muscle in the dorsal aspect of your forearm gets stretched. So even without contraction, there is some amount of extension possible here. Are you able to understand what I'm trying to say? See, my hand is intact. I don't have a palsy now, but still I'm doing maximal palmar flexion. See, naturally my fingers get extended. I am not contracting my extensors now. That is because of the resting tension in the muscle. That is not because of stimulation. There is no activation of any muscle here. But at the same time, when I do maximal dorsiflexion, you can see that naturally the fingers go in for flexion. That is because of tension in the flexor aspect.
Okay, sir.
Dr. Neelavati, am I right? That's your name.
Yes, sir.
Have I answered your doubt?
Yes, sir. It's a natural tendency
Yeah.
of the hand.
See, To understand it clearly, it is because the tension developing in the muscle group, which is exactly opposite to the movement. See, you do maximum dorsiflexion. Which muscle is getting stretched here? Your flexors are getting stretched. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
Sir,
So
yes.
naturally your flexion will happen here even without muscle contraction. Whereas when you do palmar flexion, even without contraction, the muscle stretches and causes some amount of extension here. But this is not active extension. See, this is active extension. See, now I'm not contracting my extensors now, but this is active extension. Are you able to understand?
Yes, sir.
Are you able to see my hand? See, this is passive extension. This is active extension. The patient may have some amount of active extension, which you see even in case of a wrist drop. But if you ask the patient to do this, you won't be able to see it. Am I clear?
Okay, sir.
Good. Usually, how to elicit? There are some methods to, or proper clinical method to elicit each drop. For example, if you want to elicit finger drop, you should not keep the wrist in this position. You should actually do this position so that your extensors are maximally stretched and you have flexion here. Now you ask the patient to do this. This is how you check for thumb drop. See, you don't check thumb drop in this position. For thumb drop, you do this. You cause wrist extension and then you ask the patient to do this. If suppose the patient is not able to do this, then the patient has thumb drop. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Hope I have cleared your doubt. See, all this problem is because of online class. We have a patient right in front of us, then be better to show the clinical findings in front of the patient. Any other doubts?
Elbow drop, sir.
Elbow drop again. See, you have to support the arm in this position and they ask the patient to actively extend the elbow. See, if you are making the patient to stand like this, by gravity, automatically the elbow will be extended. There is no checking of elbow extension here. So you lift the arm either posteriorly or in the sideways and allow the elbow to flex passively. Now you ask the patient to extend it. If this movement is possible, the triceps is intact and the patient will have elbow extension. If the elbow is still like this we call it as elbow drop.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Fine. Any doubts from anybody else?
Sir, I have one doubt. How to differentiate between the extension movement of thumb and radial abduction, sir? It both seem to be same.
This is again, see, hope you are able to see my hand, right? Flexion. You see the axis of movement here. This is flexion. This is extension. The axis of movement is perpendicular to the CMC joint, carpo-metacarpal joint, like this. This is not abduction. This is flexion. This is extension. This is happening in a different plane. Whereas if you bring the thumb to this plane and do this, this is radial abduction. And do this, this is palmar abduction. This is abductor pollicis brevis. This is abductor pollicis longus. Brevis is by median nerve, longus is by radial nerve.
Okay,
Clear
thank
now?
you, sir. Thank you.
Anything else?
So why does muscle enter contracture, sir, when the opposite side is not being used for a long time? I didn't
A
understand
good question.
that part.
See, when you don't do joint movements, when you don't keep the muscle, see, the function of muscle is to stretch and to contract. Okay? If suppose there is no movement in the muscle at all, there is some amount of fibrosis which happens in the muscle substance. A fibrous tissue will not be as elastic as a native muscle. When you keep exercising your muscles, your joints will be supple and your cartilage will get enough nutrition and the muscle will have good power. And once the nerve recovery happens, then the movement will be very even, or you will have a good movement at that particular joint. But if you don't when you don't give movement at all, there is complete resting position. Suppose if there is wrist drop like this, you leave the patient's hand in this way, there is no contraction of both your flexors and your extensors. Both of these muscles, see, your extensors have already lost supply. Are you following me? In case of a wrist drop,
Yes, sir.
your wrist extensors have already lost supply. You cannot cause movement there, but your wrist flexors are still innervated. So if you give some amount of passive extension by the way of a splint, the patient will be able to do this movement. So we have two advantages here. One, the joint is also supple. Your capsular contracture will not happen. If you leave the joint in one position for a longer time, definitely the joint capsule will go in for contraction or fibrosis, right? And you will get stiffness there. So this is the reason why we keep moving an affected joint. And when you leave the muscle unattended to, naturally there will be some amount of fibrosis happening even in your flexors. Because the flexors will act, like I said, only if you give some amount of dorsiflexion, your flexors will act. Are you able to recollect that point? I said, only if there is some amount of wrist extension, your flexors will be able to act in a natural way. When you leave the wrist to drop like this, there won't be effective contraction of your flexors, and naturally the muscle will go in for fibrosis. So even when the nerve recovers and when the extensors get their nerve supply, because of the capsular contracture and the muscle contracture, the patient will not be able to move his hand. This is the reason why we give splint and keep it in a functional position and do exercises of the muscles which are still innervated and which are still contracted. Hope I have answered your doubt.
Yes, sir.
Anything else? And this is a very commonly kept case in your exam. So be thorough in radial nerve anatomy. That should be, I think that should be the take-home message. A thorough radial nerve anatomy and clearly identification of the level of palsy. This is of utmost importance. With regards to management plan, most of the cases is neuropraxia. So only in case of Holstein-Lewis fracture, where there is a possibility of the bone spike causing damage to the nerve, and in case of open injuries, where the nerve may be actually cut. Only in those scenarios, you will need immediate operative intervention or surgical management. For all other cases of radial nerve palsy, all you need is splint the joint and wait for recovery. Because it is primarily motor nerve. But the same cannot be said about median nerve, because median nerve is a mixed nerve. Right? It has very good sensory function as well as motor function. With regards to radial nerve, since it has got more of a motor component and it is considered to be a type of pure nerve, the recovery potential is good. So almost for all cases, all you will need is just splint it and do some exercises. Surgical exploration of radial nerve is done rare. Any other doubts? No, just a minute.